Hey, greetings there, everyone. GleeCon is here, back at you with another episode of Lore of Warcraft. On our last episode, we finished off Cycle of Hatred, which also finished off all pre-World of Warcraft lore. Every bit of lore that we read from this point forward will concern itself with things that happened during the time period of or during the actual setting of World of Warcraft. Except for these sidebars that we're doing on every other episode, where we travel through any of the weird non-canon oddities, errata, things that are just related to World of Warcraft, but either can't be pinned down as officially canon or are just out there. And we're kind of somewhere in the middle with what we've been reading lately, which is the World of Warcraft Dungeons and Dragons setting. This was something that right after Warcraft 3 was out, they pushed out a set of core source books, and then immediately, a year or so later, when World of Warcraft came out, they just started revamping all those same books. So we're making similar books or ancillary books, but we're going to go through them all. We have been. And I've decided to slow down because a few of them are written in the voice of or written by Bran Bronzebeard, and we've already glossed over one or two of them, but this one I decided to take my time with. So this is called Lands of Mystery. We are now on the third chapter. We've covered northern and central Kalimdor, and stay a while and listen as we kick off chapter 3, southern Kalimdor, and based on the fact that it goes in alphabetical order, we're going to most likely start with Feralas on this episode. Here we go. Just getting the old pipes ready. Before heading into southern Kalimdor, I stopped in Theramore for supplies, and that would be right here, up in the Dustwallow Marsh region. Naturally, this meant tossing back a few ales in the city's sole surviving tavern, which is about all I can say about the establishment. I suppose putting things like defensive towers and walls back together is more important to humans than wetting one's whistle. Sometimes I don't think I'll ever understand these people. Still, I can't say they didn't brew an interesting throat burner or two. The food was exotic, especially the stuff cooked up from critters found in the swamp. I remember one dish called mudrock soup and bugs. That, well, I think I'll spare you the details. Suffice to say, it slid down easy and came right back out just as fast. In any event, I was telling some locals on my recent trip to Thunder Bluff and was surprised to see them all simply nodding in agreement instead of gazing at me in the typical wide-eyed wonder displayed by those who foolishly choose not to become explorers. They told me of Thurin Whitewind, a scout who'd been many places on Kalimdor in service to Jaina Proudmoore's forces. Apparently, he already spilled the beans about the wonders I'd seen, because he saw them first. Naturally, I had to meet this man as soon as possible. Much to my good fortune, he was in town at the time delivering a report, and I sought him out that evening. Thurin initially ignored me, but when I gave him my name, he opened up. I learned that this tall, lanky fellow had been all over Kalimdor, mostly in the north, collecting information. That is to say, he is a spy. Not that there's anything wrong with that, really. I met some really nice spies in my time. With his lips properly moistened, I got him to tell me a bit about the south, where I was going next, an area about which I knew little. Until this meeting, I had expected to be learning only as I traveled. Thurin gave me just what I needed, which was an overview I'll summarize here. He told me of 5 major regions in southern Kalimdor: Feralas, Thousand Needles, Tanaris, Ungoro Crater, and Silithus. Of course, Thurin purported to have visited the first 3 and knew only bits and pieces about the last 2. In addition to being the hardest to reach, they are also uncivilized. I decided to visit them last. As opposed to doing it in alphabetical order like we've been doing it. Let's see. Southern Kalimdor is by far the wildest area of the continent. Much of its lands are uncharted, and there are few settlements larger than small towns. Ancient ruins dating back to the Sundering and earlier dot the landscape. The terrain varies from thick forests and jungles to vast desert wastelands or bleak salt flats. The creatures that dwell there are vicious and deadly. One should not venture forth into the south without plenty of supplies and good strong weapons at his side. These were just some of the tidbits I learned in my few hours spent chatting with Thurin Whitewind. I have to keep an eye out for that name. Most importantly, however, I was able to gather enough information to piece together a planned travel route. I would begin my travels in the lush forest land of Feralas. Heat dangers. Heat deals non-lethal damage. Oh, okay. So this is actually something that we're not going to read, because this is how to, in Dungeons and Dragons term, how to travel in hot lands. And it's not written in the voice of Bran. It's not anything. It's just literally mechanics. So there we go. We're going to skip that. Which is good because the intro was running a bit long, but we're still going to press on and do Feralas as a zone, which is a small population, 2,200, mostly ogre because this is where Dire Maul is, but also a lot of Tauren and Night Elf. I've always thought of this more as a Night Elf land, but it's I guess a heavy Druid land. Also has a lot of Naga. It is a contested affiliation, as most of the later regions are, because they're designed to be quested in by both factions. At first I thought Feralas wouldn't be so bad. I began my journey by returning to Deslis in central Kalimdor. A friendly Griffin Master was able to arrange a flight for me to Nigel's Point, from which I began my journey by traveling southwest through the Kodo Graveyard, then toward the pass to Feralas. This is the first time when he's like really orchestrating all this. I feel like in the first and second chapters we just kind of went with it. As I topped that rise the next morning, I beheld an amazing sight, a lush valley filled with enough ancient trees to make any elf weep with joy. Best of all, towering amid them almost to the clouds stood two massive peaks topped with flat, square plateaus. I resolved that I would find a way to the summit of one of these colossal spires so that I could see the entire land spread before me. I spent the better part of that day circling the peaks, fending off wild creatures, and avoiding the stony giants that lumbered through the area on strange, silent missions. I didn't find a way to climb more than a few dozen feet up the slippery slopes. He should try to use some geometry exploits. Finally, as evening approached, I came across a cloaked night elf in foliage. His green eyes glinted with humor as he admitted to having watched me in my futile quest. He asked if I wished to see the summit, which of course I did. Then he waved his hands, uttered some mystical words, and poof! There I was, shivering in a cold breeze atop one of the windswept plateaus. What a strange fellow he was. I never did catch his name. Emerald eyes, I wonder if it's a green dragon. Thus it was that I spent the sunset looking out across the land of Feralas. Cutting through the thick forest, a road descended into the valley to the south before turning east and disappearing from view. Further east, amid the thick treetops, stone ruins jutted up like bony fingers. Westward, the land ended at the graceful curve of a beach, beyond which two large islands were visible along the horizon. I spotted the mast of a ship against the pink backdrop. People and culture. With the exception of the night elves of Feathermoon, most residents of Feralas are what we civilized folk consider barbaric. They live in simple dwellings or holes in the ground and wear whatever they can create using simple tools and whatever they can gather from their environment. Higher technologies such as stone cutting and metalwork are virtually unknown. The elves, of course, bring their own supplies and society with them, but they are not truly natives of this land. The Tauren of Camp Mohache, I don't know how we should pronounce that, are the most civilized of the bunch, but still remain true to their tribal roots. They live in cone-shaped huts made of animal skins stretched out around a single stiff pole. They are hunter-gatherers by nature and treat their surroundings with respect. Ogres, by far the worst menace in the area, are scavengers and squatters. Some dwell in the traditional mounds used by such creatures across Azeroth, but others occupy the highborn ruins. They hate anything that isn't an ogre, and sometimes even that doesn't stop them. So if you venture close to Dire Maul or one of their other dwellings, expect to be attacked. I like how the ogre mounts go back all the way to Warcraft 2, and they still, things like that just still persist and make up World of Warcraft. That's the kind of thing that's going to be neat for us to kind of look on and remember to comment on as we play. Geography. Feralas is a lush L-shaped valley stretching from Desolace in the north to touch the ocean to the west, and finally stretching eastward more than halfway across Kalimdor to the fringe of Thousand Needles. A ridge of mountains almost bisects the area, ending abruptly at the ancient highborn city now known as Dire Maul. Off the coast are two large islands, Sardor Isle, which hosts Feathermoon's stronghold, and the Isle of Dread, where Naga lurk. The climate is subtropical, with most days warm and humid and rainfall plentiful. The forests are technically jungles by any scientific description, but they pale in comparison to those of Ngoro Crater. All manner of wild creatures can be found here, including such carnivores as wolves, bears, and hippogriffs. Intelligent life also abounds, from the borderline smart animals known as Yeti to the feral, bloodthirsty gnolls, and of course the ever-present ogres that dominate the high wilderness. Watch out also for isolated pockets of cruel satyrs and harpies, either of whom will kill you first, eat you second, and ask questions last. The Dream Bough. In the northwest, east of the twin colossals enshrouded in mist, lies Jademere Lake. Within is the Dream Bough. In my first night in Feralas, spent upon that cold and windswept peak, I couldn't see the place, so I missed it in my travels the next day. This proved fortunate, as the green dragonflight guards the area, or so the elves of Feathermoon explained. A druid I met there told me that she once made a pilgrimage there, and while the dragons didn't eat her on sight, they turned her away without explanation. She believes they guard a portal of some sort, perhaps to the Emerald Dream. The twin colossals. These great mesas represent the highest points in Feralas. Sites and settlements. There are no major cities or towns in Feralas, a trait that proved pretty much true throughout all of southern Kalimdor. There's Camp Mojache. If you want to see a fine example of what a civilized barbarian looks like, here's the place to go. The Tauren of this village dress in simple animal skins, live in flimsy huts, and dance in strange mystic rituals beyond my understanding. Yet in their own way, they're as civilized as us. They have a written language, practice leatherworking and tailoring, and understand their environment better than I ever could. They also love to tell stories. I could have stayed there for weeks, but they warned me of the rainy season quickly approaching, so I scooted, but not before learning they were the main reason the ogres hadn't taken over all of Feralas. The Tauren, it seems, are involved in an endless effort to keep the ogres from encroaching on their lands. I can't help but wonder, if we were to help them defeat the ogres, could we call upon these Tauren as allies in our own conflict? And there's the ruin of Dire Maul. This used to be an elven city called Eldrathalas. It boasts towering ruins of marble, with statues carved larger than even those in Ironforge or Stormwind. Those took some serious craftsmanship, but all are broken now. I pressed on, dodging ogres when I could and slaying others, but all for naught. In the great courtyard at the center of the ruins, there was nowhere to hide. Sure, I can take on 3 or 4 ogres at a time, but a horde of them? I beat feet. I did spot several promising doorways to other parts of the city, though, and one of these days I'll pass through them. That's because Dire Maul is broken into basically multiple dungeons. Feathermoon Stronghold is a sizable fortress, overseen by Chandris Feathermoon. As we remember from War of the Ancients, that's the second in command of Duranda. This stronghold is the only alliance-held region in Feralas. The Night Elf outpost mainly occupies itself with searching for artifacts among the highborn ruins and investigating the presence of the Naga to the south. The stronghold is located off the west coast of Feralas on Sardor Isle. Friendly but distant, these elves. Isle of Dread, currently south of Sardor Isle, directly south. Across a narrow channel lies this place, home to ancient ruins from the Sundering. The Night Elves of Feathermoon studied them until recently, when Naga of the Hate Crest tribe showed up and moved in. Chandris Feathermoon is sure the Hate Crest are up to no good, a safe bet. Whatever they're looking for in that place, it bodes ill. Writhing deep. Giant bugs, the elves said, inhabit the strange ruin in the southern part of the wilderness. I took a side trip there and looked it over, but it was no ruin, more like a purple blot on the landscape, with gigantic insect legs sticking out of it. I got close enough to see there were really massive bugs flying and crawling around the place. A hive of some sort. Ick. Insects have no history or culture, so I can't say I was particularly intrigued. That's not true. They do have history and culture. I made a couple of sketches of the hive, then was on my way. I found out later that the locals referred to the insects as Silithid. This would not be my last encounter with them, unfortunately. History. While I was in Feathermoon, I heard a legend about Feralas' history, and I can't help but wonder if it's true. It probably is, although I never got far enough to find out for sure. Most legends, after all, are based in truth, and here is the legend of Feralas. Back in the days before the Sundering, the land we now call Feralas was part of a great valley that stretched across south-central Kalimdor, reaching as far east as the lake that is now the Shimmering Flats. Queen Ajara's servitors, the Highborn, dwelled here, and the city of Eldrethalas was their capital. Within its walls, the elves lived in peace. Among them was a group of powerful arcanists known as the Shendralar. Then the Sundering occurred, and the Highborn found themselves cut off from the Well of Eternity. Without their powers, they became lethargic and seemed doomed to entropy. The great elven prince Tortheldrin determined that they needed a new source of mystical power, and the only way to get this power was by stealing it from their enemies, the demons. To this end, he constructed a network of pylons intended to harness magical forces, thereby forming a force field capable of permanently confining a mighty demon, which the elves could use to feed their thirst for magic. They summoned and trapped the demon Imolthar, and for centuries the plan worked. Despite his attempts, Imolthar could not escape his prison, and the elves siphoned his energies. Yet, Tortheldrin didn't foresee that the demon's power had limits. After thousands of years, the supply faded. The elven prince, by now driven mad with his lust for power, solved the problem by slaying most of the Shendralar arcanists, forcing those he spared to continue channeling energy into the pylons, so Imolthar would remain confined. Even this wasn't enough for Tortheldrin. With no other arcanist draining energy from the demon, he was able to absorb its power for himself. In doing so, he has increased his own strength to almost unimaginable levels, but only so long as he remains where he is. Thus, Imolthar remains confined, the Arcanists remain Tortheldrin's slaves, and the once beautiful city of Eldrethalas has become an ogre-infested ruin. And that story remains canon. And also, I didn't realize when we read that story at the time that was fully explaining some of the wings of Dire Maul. I should have. And that'll be cool to go and look at that dungeon when we get there. But all of that is recounted in Chronicles. And here's our final adventure hook for this, the final part, which is an adventure hook for this zone. Feralas is a wild place filled with creatures that would as soon eat you as look at you. The Lost Messenger. A messenger recently attempted to reach Feathermoon from Gadgetstan, but never arrived. The messenger was carrying a sealed pouch containing written documents vital to the Night Elves of Feathermoon. The heroes are sent to track down the missing package, which disappeared somewhere between Camp Mojache and Feathermoon. Did ogres or gnolls ambush the poor messenger? Or is his body now trapped in a cocoon and writhing deep? Alright, so that's basically an adventure hook that would allow the DM to create any kind of dungeon, campaign, anything that they wanted in there. Alright, so, one, thank you everyone so much for watching and listening as we start Chapter 3. 2, for those of you that have been paying attention and been around for the haul here, we did it. That was the final episode we're going to do before we play World of Warcraft on the very next time we turn on. We'll be firing up Classic. This episode, all this pre-build-up lore is now in the pipe, 5x5. And I look forward to kicking off our next phase of glorious journeying in the next episode of Lore of Warcraft.